Well, hello, everybody, and here we are again. This is the Interview with an Exorcist series, the Chronicle of Gabriel, episode 14. So last week found us on some interesting adventures, and I pushed Douglas because I wanted to get to the next episode because this is really, I feel kind of guilty because I'm having more fun than anybody, perhaps, except for Douglas. I'm sure Douglas is having the time of his life. But we have what we have here is a convergence of Douglas's consolidation of his cosmology, and basically the best description that I could give of Douglas, other than being a master Waldorf teacher and protege of Werner Glass, who was the protege of Walter Johannes Stein, and who is one of the key people around Rudolf Steiner, is that he has focused on Rudolf Steiner's cosmology for the last, 45, 50 years or so, and has been able to pull it together in a digestible form for the sincere student. It's not easy because nothing about Rudolf Steiner's work is particularly easy, although it's fun. And when you're having an enjoyable time, it makes it easier to go through the 36 and a half feet of shelf space of his collected edition and dip in where you can and try to inhabit anthroposophy. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about coming to the point in your understanding where you can actually inhabit anthroposophy, have an actual kind of personal relationship with the being anthroposophia. And so this is a key episode here in which Douglas is going to share to us his stories regarding the Waldorf Institute in the Detroit area. Douglas, how are you?
Well, I'm good, John. And I don't know that I'm having all that much fun telling all these stories because I have to go back and relive this stuff. And boy, it was tough the first time. So reliving it now is, it's it's a mixed bag for me. For instance, today I had already kind of made light of what people think is the most important thing that ever happened to me in my life, which is I helped write the third treatment for Star Wars, which basically did become the movie or parts of the movie. So I got to go back to that because, in a way, it's exactly what you said. I'm trying to share with people how I came to believe what I believe and how I have developed a cosmology, which is, of course, stolen mostly from Steiner. But you got to steal from the best and then go on with the rest. And so, of course, I stole it all from Steiner, but I was also clairvoyant. So when I'm reading his stuff, I'm saying, yep, that's the experience I have. Because as he walks down through all these stages, well, that all happened to me by the time I was 14 and hopefully grew out of it by the time I, left Springfield and went into the military. And that definitely woke me up. But coming to Detroit was a real big wake up because it was, as I've said many times, considered to be, as they called it in the news, the darkest city in America. There was no groceries around. There were no shops around. There were no people around. And I lived on these three streets that were about 6 blocks long. And those three streets were called Indian Village. And they ran right up to the major street going along the river, the Detroit River. And living in Indian Village, I'm going to have to describe that a little bit here in a minute. But when I first came to Detroit and I helped Werner set up the bookshop and basically decided I wasn't coming back to Detroit, I had already been there. I had already done that and said no. But I really did like Werner, and there was a big Jesuit house here and a Jesuit university, and Mercy College, the Waldorf Institute, was directly connected with Mercy College, so you could get college credits. So I was going to get another couple degrees using my funds from the GI Bill. And if you don't know what that is, it means if you've been in the military, they give you money to go to school when you get out. So I'm in the bookstore, and I never really thought anything about those two things that happened prior. Matter of fact, Werner never brought them up again after I'd talked with, he knew full well the person that he had shifted over to the bookshop for me to talk to was Kathleen Kennedy, Steven Spielberg's assistant, because he knew all the people out there, as you mentioned recently. He was in the Hollywood area, and he had the Waldorf School there. And so many of the rich stars, producers, directors, and the big money people sent their children to the Waldorf School. And he knew them all because he was there and running a teacher training program there. So when a person named Rudy Wilhelm, who had inherited some money in his family, he was a doctor also. He and his wife, Amelia, decided they wanted a Waldorf school. They decided to get the best. That was Werner and Barbara Gloss. And then Werner brought in Hans Gabert and Rosemary Gabert, another couple, and Theo and Mariana Bergen. So those three couples started the Detroit Waldorf School with the intent from the beginning to have a teacher training institute as part of the school. Because how are you going to teach someone if you don't have children around to show them how to actually carry these ideas out? So I've always believed and always supported and created a few myself, teacher training institutes inside of a Waldorf school so that it would be a complete organic unit that would be able to be self-sustaining, because you need teachers. Well, to do that, you need a master teacher to run the teacher training program, and that was Werner Gloss. So anyway, I didn't think anything about it. I went to Europe, was gone for a long time, came back, and it never came up. Star Wars never came up. At some point, it came up when the movie was released, and it was offered to the Waldorf schools for the initial showing. There was such a hype about it that we could have made a lot of money by charging $100 a seat for a preview of any of the first three, because the first three were offered. And then, as I'm going to tell you, the ninth story, the ninth one in the series, and then when I say the first three, I mean the first three that came out on the screen, which are now actually number 4, 5, and 6, because they were prequels, 3 prequels and 3 sequels. But the ones in the middle are the one that actually took the story that I wrote, which was rewritten from a very ridiculous story. It was one of the worst stories I'd ever read in my life, because George Lucas had made a movie. What was it called? THNX 123 or some stupid name. And it was a movie from the perspective of a robot. Strictly from the perspective of a robot. Now go ahead, character development on a robot. Yeah, try that. So this movie I was handed the first 2 treatments of, which had been rejected from the studios, that George Lucas had been offered 2 contracts if he would build on his award-winning movie producing capacities from American Graffiti, which I thought was a terrible movie and certainly required no skill to make at all. But anyway, they offered him 2 contracts, and his wife, Marcia Lucas, came to the Institute when I was there the first time. And Werner said to me, we're going to sit down with this woman. We're going to help her out. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever you say, Werner. So we sat down, and of course, Werner and Hans got up and left within 2 minutes and said, we're giving you over to Douglas. He'll help you. There were also 2 students in the room. Some of you know this story because it's now been in books. The people who wrote the true story of Star Wars talked to me ad nauseum, put out another book with a chapter just on the story I'm telling you. There's a guy in Europe who touts this all the time, saying that anthroposophy is in the Star Wars and that he knows the guy who put it there. That'd be me. He interviewed me on the phone many, many times. And not long ago, he gave a talk on the Waldorf teacher who inspired Star Wars at the Goetheanum in the Great Hall. And it was packed, standing room only, people out into the halls, right? He never mentioned my name, and they've never asked me to give a talk. And he and I disagree. And now it's pretty funny that he disagrees with what I say I created and what the meaning of it is. And so he doesn't talk to me much anymore because he wrote story after story, became famous for this because he was touting that Star Wars is anthroposophy. Well, yeah, it is kind of. But it's basically the standard old story of, that you'd tell anywhere. It's a fairy tale. And so the character, the whole point of my involvement in it was to wake people up to Darth Vader. And I think Marcia Lucas, in the way that she did the film editing on it, did a great job because he was a terrifying character. That's Ahriman. I literally built that in on purpose as the incarnation of Ahriman. Half man, half machine, and that his dilemma is that his son, and then it was twins, because I had to deal with the fact that George Lucas had written Princess Leia as the girl that was found when what was his name? Something Star Killer. I forget his Star Killer. I think that's what they called him. So when Star Killer met the princess, it was to get a kyber crystal that you could make a lightsaber out of, right? In his original story, and it was really told completely from the point of view of two robots, and the lead character had a dog, and they barely ever spoke. That's why Chewbacca doesn't really communicate, only to his master, because he's a dog. And it was to be a cowboy in space with his dog, who gets the girl because he gets the kyber crystal. I mean, it's really, it really, it sucked. I'm sorry to have to use those terms, but it was really, really, really bad. So we just completely tore the whole thing apart and started inserting characters. So Obi-Wan Kenobi, that was my idea. Luke Skywalker, that name I made up and developed the character. Darth Vader. But why? We wanted to show the archetypal tension between the human ego, the human I am, that has three parts, and that's Leia, Han Solo, and Chewbacca. So thinking, feeling, and willing. Of course, Hans is thinking, Leia is feeling, and Chewbacca is willing, right? And here's Luke, and he's innocent. He doesn't really know even what he's looking for, what he's doing. He doesn't know his fate, like all human beings. So it's the classic scenario of the fairy tale. And then Yoda was never to be a master. Yoda was something I tried to get out of it altogether, because he was a comic interlude during the training of Obi-Wan Kenobi with Luke Skywalker, or Lucas Skywalker, as I named him, but they changed it to Luke. And so Alex Guinness was supposed to be the master with an apprentice. And this was like the Templars. It was like what's called a fair witness in science fiction, Robert Heinlein. So I built basically the path of initiation into this. And that's what it was all about, was the path of initiation. But Alex Guinness hated George Lucas and quit before even the first part of the story could be done. So they had to stick in Yoda as the master, which is very cute, but it's a little bit too corny for me, because really it was supposed to be about the training of a person like what I was going through. I was a Jesuit. I was underneath another Jesuit who was underneath another Jesuit, and I was being trained to fight evil, really. But in the end, I found out the Jesuits were evil, and or that they, some people turn. The Catholic Church, I thought, was this wonderful thing. And then I saw the truth of the matter, and I realized that here I am, still connected to these Jesuits, and putting the Jesuit training, or the training of the Templar Knights, or basically the initiatory training of the mystery centers, into this movie with zero concern about the fact that it would or would not get on the silver screen. I didn't care. We hated movies in Waldorf education, and I was going to train to be a Waldorf teacher. We didn't go to movies. We didn't watch TVs, and we certainly didn't have a whole lot of people get killed in a movie. In the version that I wrote, Princess Leia is the hero because she is really the higher self. And that's the attainment that he makes, is to understand that his twin sister, who was born of Ahriman, was the antidote to him going into thinking he needed to be a warrior. And so the lightsaber wasn't a lightsaber. It was your pineal gland, and it was the ability to activate those crystals. That's why they refer to it as crystals. And it creates a body of light. So if anybody shoots anything at you, if you have your hand up, it can either absorb it and build up the energy you have around you, or it can go back to them as a mirror, directly back to them. So if they want to try to kill you and shoot you, then it's going to go right back and kill them. And that was the only weapon that there was going to be ever. That and the ability to use your hand and gestures, and like the Jedis do, to say no, you're not going to do that. That and the voice, which they never really carried forward on the voice from Dune, Robert Heinlein's Dune. They had this capacity to use your voice as healing or as a weapon. So there were many parts of it that didn't get into it. But by the ninth one, you get this young lady, and she becomes the heroine. And Luke Skywalker looks like a bimbo. He's trying to turn into what they tried to make Alex Guinness look like, which was somebody who's there one moment and then translates into heaven and isn't there the next moment, but then speaks to you from heaven for, as your guide. Well, no, the tree, it was all about the tree and the leaves of the tree that were put in the book of wisdom that were held on the sacred island. And then the girl goes there and, Luke goes there, he transcends, she goes there and transcends. So, if you piece it all and then you pull it apart and you take a lot of the cartoons, because some of the cartoons that they did written by other people, no, George Lucas wrote literally almost none of it. And these other writers did take some of the components that we had in that treatment that I helped write, and it got into the movie. But then people say this had the biggest effect on the greatest amount of people on the earth. And I think, wow, I shouldn't just skip over that in my audio biography, as you've characterized it. I should go back and say, no, it was planned to have anthroposophy in it, period. Absolutely, completely, 100%. As an adult fairy tale, as Novalis had told us, history shall become a fairy tale, and your biography can be a fairy tale. And so, yes, I did make sure that anthroposophy got in it through and through. And I made sure that anthroposophy got into the talks with Kathleen Kennedy that led Spielberg to do Poltergeist. And then later she called me for years, and we talked about the series as they ran along with the Indiana Jones movies. And eventually she came to the Mayflower, and everybody got to meet her, and we'd sold her hundreds and hundreds of books so that they could come up with good storylines for these Indiana Jones movies. But again, they took the character of Otto Rahn, the Nazi, who, yes, Hitler did have a character who went out looking for the Holy Grail and everything else, the Ark of the Covenant, the Shiva stones, everything. Yes, true. But they got carried away on it. So I don't want to diminish the fact that impulse, I did it totally for free, working with Marcia Lucas, for free with Kathleen Kennedy, until Robert got mad and said, you have to charge this lady $100 an hour to talk with her. So I started charging $100 an hour, but it wasn't that much money in the long run that I was paid for basically writing those stories. And she would simply listen to the storyline I'm telling her, and she'd write it down, and then they'd go and bastardize it and put it on the big screen and make a lot of money. But there are people who have literally said to me, without knowing any idea that I was connected with it, the Indiana Jones movies are the most important things that ever happened to me in my life. I have people who tell me that Star Wars is their religion, and that they're certain that it was divinely inspired and blah, 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 blah. No, it was taken from anthroposophy and it was turned into a fairy tale. So you might want to remark about that.
And so there you have it. And it's pollen. Novalis, you mentioned Friedrich von Hardenberg, the wonderful German Romantic poet who was contemporary with Goethe, but he passed away in his early 30s. And it's important to understand that in working with these archetypes, if viewed from spiritual science, Rudolf Steiner mentions how ideas that are shared, they conjoin with beings, and that these beings are, in the spiritual world, astral forms that consolidate ideas. Like he gives the example of that if you think of courage, that on a certain level you're united with other people who are contemplating courage, and so that there's a certain capacity for this grouping, like what Christ says. He says, whenever two or more are gathered in my name, I am in the midst of them. So he is the highest example of that particular phenomena or reality. And so what Douglas is talking about here, and to be tied into something that has literally reached billions of people, is really a profound awakening for Douglas, I'm sure, because to think that there's this community of people that have contemplated these archetypes, and that you had such a important hand in developing the relationship with the spiritual beings that are behind those archetypes. So that's terribly profound. And it's funny because it gets into smaller and smaller circles, because like you mentioned, poltergeist. Well, if you remember in Poltergeist, there was this old guy who was balding with scraggly hair. That was Julian Beck. And Julian Beck was the founder of Living Theater in Europe. And he was actually involved with Federico Fellini and a lot of movies. And in fact, Leo Zagami's grandmother was good friends with Julian Beck, and she was in Fellini movies. And my friend, you may even remember him, Cal Barber. He was in Living Theater, and he was in Fellini movies. And so then Leo's grandmother helped get Michael Chekhov to America, to Connecticut, to start his acting school. So these things, all these circles of people are karmic groupings, and we're not exactly clear what, of course, is involved in all of that, but you see from the manifestations that result from it that this is a counterpoint to this whole Darth Vader realm they're trying to impose in the current time. So I think this is a very important conversation.
Yes, and the picture that's behind me, which we'll get probably zoomed in on in a while, was done by our dear friend Howard Weingarten, and he would go into a trance and paint you. And that whole picture, I watched it manifest in like no longer than 15 minutes, but that's like the fifth version he did. He'd go into this manic trance, and he called it psychic painting or something like that. And so he painted it 3 or 4 times, didn't like it, started all over again. And that was like the 4th or 5th time. And that's what I look like, except you can't see that my hair went down to my waist. And that cape I'm wearing, well, I wore a cape, and I wore big boots that went up to my up to my knees. And I did not look like a normal person, because I was still kind of out of time and space, as it were. But anyway, so there I am in Indian Village, and I start living with this family, these 2 doctors, very rich, and I drive their children around, and I'm a mother's helper, and I do the lawn, but I also take care of their 14 properties. And so I was in charge of housing for the Institute. So I was in charge of the bookstore, in charge of housing, and was Werner's confidant. And so Werner didn't tell people that I was clairvoyant. He didn't tell people I was a Jesuit. And the first time around, I found out I wasn't going to be able to live in the Jesuit house, because it was just terrible. So I ended up living in Indian Village, just a few doors down from where the Institute had their classes, in the Kearney building, a beautiful little building. And all these amazing people came. But it was built upon, as I said before, an Indian village, which they killed every man, woman, and child when the settlers came out there. And so the place was haunted. And many of these houses were, some of them literally, they were mansions. And I lived in one of the bigger houses with these people. But a few doors down was a haunted house. And right behind it was a haunted house. It was a convent that literally had gargoyles on it. And it was, I don't know why anyone built this thing. I never got inside of it. It was so haunted that it wouldn't let me get inside. And I never saw anyone in it in all the years I lived there. Though I was told there were some old nuns who lived there. I don't know that. And across the street was another haunted house from a woman who was what they called, in those old days, a well-kept woman. So one of these big car executive people had a mistress, and he built this gorgeous house, which even had a music room for chamber music. Spared no expense. The house was haunted like crazy. So right in a ley line, one house, right the next one, and then one across the street, were 3 of the most ridiculously haunted houses in Indian Village. Now, there were a bunch of haunted houses in Indian Village. And unfortunately, I got known for doing the following. I would, I could just look at a house and say, yep, it's got a hidden treasure in it. And like the first house that I lived in, this house I was just describing, I found immediately, I said, well, why you do know there's a secret cabinet here for silver, don't you? And the doctors said, what are you talking about? You had to hit it 3 times, and then the door popped open. It looked like it was part of the wall, and here's like hundreds of pieces of silver that were really beautiful and antique and old. So whoever lived in it before died, took the secret to their grave. And later on, I was up doing some work in kind of this attic, kind of a storage attic kind of thing. And I realized that underneath there was a lock box. So I pulled up the boards, they were nailed down, and lo and behold, here's a lock box, and gave it to the owners of the house and said, and they opened it, and there was some gold and silver coins in it and some other kind of valuable stuff. So they told their friends, and they told their friends. So all the way up and down this 6 blocks on these 3 streets named after Indians, Iroquois, Seminole, and ours was called Burns. Why? Because they burnt them down, probably Burns. Okay. It was a horrible place that was filled with unresolved trauma from death. And so these houses were just as haunted as they could possibly be. But people would invite me in. They'd say, well, come to my house, see if you can find anything, So I did. Oh, Lord, at least half the time there was something, some kind of pseudo treasure or something, that someone had hid and took to their grave. I mean, I guess it's a common thing when you're rich that you become so greedy that you can't remember where all of your stashes are. So anyway, the house 3 doors down, which I ended up living in, 1007 Burns, was one of the 3 oldest houses in Detroit. And it had been in the downtown area, right on the place where they killed a bunch of other Indians, a village that was right downtown. So the rich people had moved out a little bit, a few miles down the river, and built this thing, Indian Village. And later they put a racetrack on it, one of the first racetracks around, where the Detroit car people raced their cars. That literally became exactly where the Detroit Waldorf School was. But the point is that this stone house was taken apart by Captain Russell. Well, actually, he owned the Detroit Iron Works. His name was Walter Russell. Isn't that funny, John? And I'm thinking, oh, that's interesting. So he went from Detroit Iron Works to owning a ferry that ferried back and forth between Detroit and Windsor. And he had 2 children and his wife. And so they knocked that house down, numbered it. They're granite glacial stones, very, very beautiful, strong stones. They knocked it down, labeled them, brought it down to Indian Village, built it back in mirror image. Every time I went by the place, every time, there was a ghost in the front window. At first, she always wore white, and she was dressed in these fantastic fashions from the past, and she'd look at me, and you could tell she was trying to communicate something to me, or I could tell, and I didn't know what it was, but I didn't know the people in that house. I wasn't going to go knocking on their door. I was kind of new there, I did that later sometimes if I think somebody had a house that had a ghost in it, or that was possessed, or some horrible thing needed to be cleared. I'd volunteer my services. I never ever charged for house clearings. Never charged ever for moving somebody along that was a true shell of a person, a ghost as they call them. So anyway, I'd see this lady, and she'd be in the front window, and then it advanced, and then it turned into a vision, and she'd go out the side door and get in a carriage. Like, man, this lady, this ghost, is this a ghost? What is this? Later, she no longer got into the carriage. She would sit in the front window wearing all black. And so I started to get very nervous. I'm thinking, what is this? Is this a premonition of my death or something? I mean, come on. Every friggin' time I walk by the house, and when you're clairvoyant, all you have to do is Rudolf Steiner actually gives exercises. You just dim down your vision so that you don't see just the outside of something. You relax your eyes and you see the whole environment. And then something spooky happens. If you're looking at a person, a bunch of eyes start to appear, and you go, oh, freaky color, oh, and you want to run away, right? That's you looking at yourself. And then if you go beyond that, you can see this glow, and the glow fits in, and you get all 3 things happening at once. Well, that's what I'd do. Is I'd walk by that house. I'd kind of look over there and let that kind of funny, super sensible organ. And there she'd be. She never spoke a word. Now, normally, if you're going to see a ghost, they have a message for you, right? Some kind of strange message. You were in that house, right, John? The stone house? Yeah. One of the most haunted places I've ever been. I lived in that house for years. And here's the strange, well, I don't know which part of this story to tell next. Okay, so the Kearney building that I go to school in the front, is a real estate agent. And he's sitting there ready to sign the stone house over to somebody else because they're buying it. And the wife had signed, the man was signing, and he looked up and he goes, "The house is on fire. The house they're buying is on fire." So they all run out. And I don't know, I was around somewhere because I saw them. So I ran down there with them. And the roof is on fire. They had been doing some work on the house, and the workman caught the roof on fire. So the fire engines pulled up and they destroyed the whole place, knocked holes in it, put so much water in it, it was water damaged, and it went up. And then one day, those people moved out who were selling it, and the people who were going to buy it, they didn't buy it. So one day, the insurance agent's down there, and I'm just 3 doors down. So I see him. I go down and say, "Yeah, how much? Well, I'll give you $10,000 for this piece of crap because I know you're going to write the whole thing off." And the guy starts laughing, and he's like, "Make it 15 and you can have it." So I go tell my bosses who had 14 houses, and they love to buy stuff. They buy every house. They always sending me out to try to find more places to buy. So we get the house for 15,000, we renovate it, and the following starts to happen. You start to hear a wheelchair that is being pushed very fast from the breakfast area. This is a big house. And then it slows down right until it gets in front of the fireplace in the living room. And you can literally hear this. It's like there's people heard this all the time. They go, "What is that? What is that?" I didn't know what it was at first, but it was, of course, it was the lady in the wheelchair, right? And I didn't find out until later, much later. Lived in the house for years, and anytime I'm in my room, the door handle would move, and you'd hear the wheelchair moving around. Another friend lived there, and he didn't even see the ghost. You could go. This house had an elevator put in it, and at the bottom in the basement, the ghost lived. She sat in her wheelchair there, and I was there every time I ever looked. And he wanted to live in the house before I moved in, and I said, "Oh, I don't. It's not even habitable yet." I said, "Well, let's just see if, because it was lightning. It was lightning and thunder at the minute that I took him to this house, take him to the basement where people had been killed in the root cellar. I never went in there. And here's the lady who had died in the wheelchair, falling from the 13th floor of the Book Cadillac building, leaving her tax agent. And I know because the tax agent's secretary came into that house during a tour of the house because we put it up on tour after we fixed it all up. And she said, no, she was there. She was there when Mrs. Russell came to sign the tax forms, and she was pushed into an open elevator and dropped 13 floors to her death. And that's why she went from wearing all white to all black. But her husband and her 2 sons died on this ferry that he was obsessed about, taking people back and forth between Windsor and Detroit. He and his 2 sons, who took his place as the captain of that ferry, died in boating in accidents on the Detroit River. That's the reason the house was so haunted.
Which is another interesting thing because on my mother's side of the family, we have Russells. And so it's possible these are some distant relations of me. So that's kind of funny. But yeah, you kind of shook me with that one because and again, that's the way these things work. So the closer you get to certain things, the more points of convergence end up. And so please continue. This is
behind that house was the convent. And I'm pretty sure that those nuns had horrible things done to them, because in the 11 years I lived in that area, I never once saw anyone come or go in that house. And I wanted that house bad. My bosses would have paid any price to get that house. And I wanted it because it had all these cool things on it, like gargoyles and amazing, features on the house. And it had its big, tall, 12-foot wall and a garden. And if you would go to my house and get into the on top of the garage, you could look into their garden, and it was a beautiful, beautiful garden. But no one was ever in it. Never saw a person come or go. I don't know how they ate. I don't even know if anybody was ever there. 11 years. That was the spookiest thing going on there. No car ever, no person, no nothing. It's like, wow, how come I always get connected to places like this? And right across the street was where the capital woman died, but she died very unhappy. And some say that they put a curse on the house, and I didn't know what they were talking about, so I looked into it. And yes, every owner had been a woman, and every owner had died in it. There'd been like 5 or 6 owners, right? Well, at the time that I moved into the stone house, the lady who was there, how did that happen? She got kicked out. She got evicted, and the sheriff put her stuff out in the street while I had this garage, as part of my house. That actually the McCarthys owned the house. I didn't own the house, the stone house. It was the spookiest. It was absolutely, if you couldn't get spooked in that house, you'd never get spooked anywhere, because you could hear the wheelchair going around. You could watch doors opening and closing. If you went in a room and you locked the door, the handle would keep moving, and I'd have to talk to the ghost to say, Mrs. Russell, okay. It was always when I was alone, every time. If anyone who was ever in that house alone had these experiences, except the guy I let move in there to begin with, I showed him underneath where the elevator went down. She was sitting right there, just glowing, white, glowing. It was like, how could she miss it? I said, oh, stick your hand in there. I expected him to feel the cold, the cold spot, right? Because that's what you feel, right? He didn't feel a cold spot. So I said, all right, Michael, stick your head in there. So he sticks his whole head in there, and he's got his head right in the body of the ghost. And he pulls it out, and no problem. Anyway, he died not too long thereafter of cancer, strange cancer. But anyway, 2 other people moved in there. I won't mention their names. One of them's still alive, but they moved into the master bedroom. The master bedroom had a widow's walk, where you opened it up and there was just this kind of like a porch. But from there, you could see the Detroit River, where her husband and 2 sons died. And I guess the ferry was right near there, so she could look out there and see. And so the big doors that opened up would always open up. You couldn't close them. I took nails this big, hammered them, and I did everything. I just gave up, because the house wasn't well heated anyway, and nobody was living there. But when this couple moved in, I let them move in, because it's a big, beautiful master bedroom. There's like 7 bedrooms in this house, 5 bathrooms. It was a huge place. They moved in, and they kept thinking I was pranking them, because no matter what they did, that dadgum door would not stay closed all night long. It would open up every single night. And they thought I was doing it. You know this couple, by the way. I'd mentioned them, except one of them is still alive, and he probably doesn't want to remember this. And then other people I brought there, I'd say, oh, wait a second, here she comes. And they'd hear the wheelchair, and they'd freak out, because they were hearing a noise that rolled right up to them like a spook was coming up on them, which it was. And so nobody could ever really stay in that house except those 3 people and myself. Everybody else got kind of terrified, because, when the door handle keeps moving and you go out and look in the hall and nobody's out there, what are you going to do? And all kinds of strange things happened in that house. I was standing on it once with Michael, the guy who I said stuck his head in the ghost, and a gun battle starts, because I just want to characterize Detroit for you. We're up there looking at the caulking on the chimney, and a gun battle starts. But how do we know? Because the first bullet zooms right past Michael's head, like within inches, and hits this cement, hits the brick on the chimney. And he goes, we look at each other and go, get down. We drop down, and a battle ensues with 2 cars, keep going around the block, shooting at each other. And sometimes the bullets come right up there. And so just when we think we can get up, bullets keep flying by. That's Detroit in the days when I moved here.
Yeah, I can attest to that. We used to, me and some of my friends, we used to, for this person who bought properties in Detroit, go in there and maybe like fix the electric lights or salvage fixtures, stuff like that. And we'd end up going up on the roof. There'd be bullets all over the roof. I mean, of course, a lot of that was from 4th of July, people firing off their guns, but still, it's kind of disconcerting when you get up on the roof and there's a bunch of bullets just laying around. It's like, where does that happen?
In Detroit. Matter of fact, every time I'd walk up to the bank, because I had really long hair, I looked like a hippie, of course, and I'd walk up to the bank just for exercise through another little fancy area. What's that called? Something Village, East Village. And then someone would follow me home with a gun and try to rob me, right? And it was like I'd just laugh at them. I'd say, don't use a revolver when you have no bullets in the gun. Because many times these people are robbing you with a gun they don't even have a bullet for, okay? And so I had two crews that did work for us because we had 14 buildings and I was in charge of collecting rent and renting them out and maintaining them. So I had two work crews all the time and people who did lawns, for us all the time. So these guys, they'd come to rob me and I'd just say, you're really a bad robber. I was putting money in the bank, not taking it out. Here, look, I have no money. You hungry? Come on over to my house. I'll fix your lunch. And so I'd oftentimes end up hiring these people who tried to rob me. But one day someone was trying to rob me and I could tell they had real bullets and they were a crackhead. And I actually did have $750 in my pocket. I was going to go buy something. And somebody opens a window in this village because there's these apartments there and starts shooting at the guy. This is Detroit, man. This is like, I'm not exaggerating one iota. At least 5 or 6 times armed robbery where somebody's got a gun, they're pointing it in my face, where I just talked them out of it and, told them I'd hire him or whatever. Here, let me go to my house. I got money in the drawer. You need some money for food? We can go out to lunch. You want to go to the, blump, 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 whatever. So that was just Detroit. But anyway, going back to these haunted houses, the convent or the stone house, I was never able to clear. Never able to clear that house. Nothing I could do. And the things I witnessed in that house, I could go on all day long about things that I witnessed. Even looking out the window or things that came to the house. For instance, people would give me things that were cursed and ask me to hermetically seal them and get rid of them because they had caused people severe illness, damage, death, blah, blah. So one day somebody gave me something that they said was the most cursed thing they'd ever seen. It was something from India. It looked like a bracelet and a ring or something. And I said, oh, okay. So I immediately took it, put it in a box, hermetically sealed it, prayed and blah, 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 and put it on my altar. And then I was going to bury it, but I wanted it to get charged up with good energy. The only time anyone ever broke into our house, they broke in and they took that. They didn't take the gold that was sitting next to it, the crystal balls, the tons of crystals. They didn't take the big boom box sitting there. They took nothing except the cursed box. And I swear, those were the most cursed things. I couldn't clear them. They were horrible. That they supposedly had caused the death of multiple people who owned the bracelet and the ring and the earrings or something. And so when this lady gave it to me, she was totally freaked out and said, please, please, I don't know what to do with this. The Catholic Church won't take it. They don't take cursed things. And so I was also used by the Catholic Church in those days for such things. So they still felt, because I was a Jesuit associate, they could call me up and say, would you check this out? Would you check this out? The bishop's house is haunted. That was one of them. Early on, I had to go look at later, I had to go back and clear that house again because the haunting came back. But supposedly, they said I cleared it the first time, but later on, one of the biggest names in basketball, the Detroit Pistons, lived in that house, and I was invited there to do a clearing because everybody was being bothered by a poltergeist, right? So I went there and cleared it, and this time I got it, and it stayed away. But I did all kinds of things like that. But Indian Village was filled with those kind of houses, filled with houses that had treasure in them that no one had discovered, filled with houses that had horrible hauntings from the Indians who were all massacred there, horrible hauntings from women who had been abused. Like 3 of those houses are really women in a row. Boom. It was Mrs. Russell, the convent, and the Cap Lady. And they were so haunted, you could stand in between the houses and feel the cold, running through you because that's how haunted they were. Well, I lived in that house for years. You were in that house, weren't you? Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to keep in mind what I was saying earlier about that there's this kind of community of the shared idea and the being of the shared idea. And that goes for bad things too. And so that can kind of give you at least something to contemplate regarding why would somebody crawl in the window and grab that one thing and leave. that what's up with that, as they would say here in Detroit. I remember when my brother and a bunch of friends got all excited because they found a very inexpensive place to move into over near Trumbull in the city. And I said, I don't know about that. You're asking for it. So they move into this house and they have a barbecue and invite all the neighbors over. 2 days later, guys are crawling in the second floor window with shotguns. You living for the city, as Stevie Wonder said.
That's what we experienced in those days. I don't mean to be too grim. I'm going to move on because I'm going to move out of Indian Village in this story by the end of it. But I will just say the neighbor to the right of us had his throat slit when he opened his door. The neighbor to the left of us was shot when he opened the door to someone. In our house, we had a 10-foot brick wall in the backyard, and then there was the alley and a big dumpster there. A body was found there. Our neighbors across the street found a body in their dumpster. And if you went one street beyond that, their alley abutted the area where the crack houses were, where just horrible things throughout Detroit. As you drive around in Detroit in those days, because they didn't knock down old houses, what they would do is they'd do horrible things in a house and then they'd burn it. And so you'd see these burnout houses. And if I didn't have my guard up, unfortunately, I would see a lot of this stuff come in. And as I said last time, the Detroit Waldorf School was a day school for the rich people's children. But in the end, we found human bones in the boiler, beneath where the gas is. And I could never clear that school either. And to this very day, I believe it's still possessed by the same spirits, because these rich people, they're some of the worst. And they built their houses, these mansions. These are the Dodges, the Fords. These are all these rich people in Detroit, like, Captain Russell, who was, he might have been your relative. It's the Detroit Iron Works. He owned Detroit Iron Works. Every building in downtown Detroit had his ironworks on it before he became a captain, where he then drowned, and his two sons followed in his stead.
Yeah, that's the Wright Russell family. My grandmother's her father was the John Finn and Sons. They built the cathedral and almost all the Catholic schools and many of the mansions in Grosse Pointe and the Highland Park plant for Henry Ford. But they were Russells were relations. I don't recall which, like one of her sisters or something like that was married to one. I don't recall at this point. But the point is to try and understand how integral the Catholic community is in Detroit, because see, Detroit originally was a Fort Detroit, and that was founded by like Michigan was explored by Jesuit priests, and I used to work with this guy Donald Gauthier, and his wife had that bagatelle down in Plum Street, the hippie street, where they would sell the bread with the French bread. And she used to get mucklucks from the Eskimos up in the Arctic Circle. And her son was a friend of Howard's, who you mentioned painted your painting. But Donald Gauthier, he used to collect Jesuit maps of Michigan. He had the actual original Jesuit maps, and he would show them to me. And he'd have a modern map, and he'd say, "Look at they did with a canoe and just sight lines." And he would have these amazing maps of all over Michigan from the Jesuits. So it evolved into Detroit, and Detroit was really mostly Catholic. For a long period of time in the city part. When you went out in the suburbs, then you got the Episcopalians, a lot of the Eastern money people and all that came into Detroit. But you had a lot of Irish and Polish and French and Belgians and Germans, German Catholics, and Italians. And so it was a very much an integrated Catholic community to a large extent. And so that's just to give some kind of context to what Douglas is saying, because a lot of these places, he may have even built the building you're talking about. You see, I don't know, because I haven't been able to access all of the records. But so it's very interesting, because when you look at things like this and you go, well, what is this transformation taking place? Being able to make a transition from that whole milieu and evolve the Waldorf education system in America, coming out of kind of the ashes of that whole development. So it's fascinating.
It is, and all those churches, your relatives are part of building some of them. And these fantastic churches a lot of them had decayed. And so I'd go around to them, and they even had the old Latin Mass down at St. Joe's. So I went to all these churches because I was interested in seeing the architecture and all that kind of stuff. So it was dark, but it also had tremendous light. Every spiritual group you can imagine at some point or another had a headquarters in Detroit. And so what Werner and the people who ran the Institute felt, even though the Waldorf School was in Indian Village in downtown Detroit, it was not drawing the people they thought it should. So they wanted to move. And so they started looking for places. And I was always involved as, Werner didn't tell people why he was bringing me, but I was checking out the energy of the place and checking out whether or not I could see a future for us there. And we had looked in Clawson, and that thing came down to an explosion. We'd looked in right out where Brian Lynch ended up living, where I ended up getting that school later, the Washington School out in Southfield. We looked at that one. That one exploded because the people didn't want us moving in because they thought we were bringing Black children with us out to the neighborhoods. That's how prejudiced it was at the time. It was really pathetic. And then we found a place in Royal Oak, and we were just about ready. We were closing on the deal. The very last 11th hour, it went bad and didn't get that one. But they were desperate to get out of Detroit. Later, they fired me at the Detroit Waldorf School because they wanted to get out of Detroit. And they said that I had the finance people do a feasibility study to move the school to the school that I just mentioned, the Washington School. Later, that became one of my many schools, but it wasn't feasible. And so the board came back and said, "Oh, it's not economically feasible." They blamed me for that and pretty much fired me after 5 years, or after, I don't know, 10 years of working there. But anyway, the point is that we were always looking for a place. And so Werner was, he was always saying to me, if Carolyn McCarthy, the people I worked for, if they ever hear any place, because she was always looking for stuff, she's building schools and stuff. If she hears of any place, let us know. So I'm driving her daughter out to some party, some rich friends way out there in the suburbs. And I have Coriander with me, and we're driving along a 9 mile, I guess it is. And it's all a bunch of trees. There's a little tiny opening. And I look over and I think I'm hallucinating, literally. And I drive off the road, actually, and do get back on. But I was blown away. I said, wait, that looks like Assisi, because I'd been in Italy, and this looked like St. Francis of Assisi's monastery. And here's John and I and Brian and Robert, the monastic club. We're standing there at a portico, and above it, it says something in Latin. And all this happens in 1 second, 1 millisecond, as I look through this hole and go, boom, and get this incredible vision. And we're trying to decipher what the Latin says. And we're debating it back because we had this club, the monastic club. We were always debating everything. So we're debating this, and I almost wreck. So I drive her to where she's going, come back, and pull over and look through the hole. And by God, if the four of you, that's me too, still standing there arguing about the Latin translation. So I start walking towards this vision, and it starts to fade. Finally, I get there, and by golly, it is a Latin inscription, and I don't know what it means. And I'm looking at Duns Scotus Monastery, which was for Franciscans, and I didn't know about it. I was a Jesuit. So I said, this is it. And I walk around the front, and there's a sign that says that they're leasing it or something. So I go back and tell Werner, and bingo bango, we move out to this fantastic place, Duns Scotus Monastery, which has a whole bunch of acreage. It's the only original prairie grass growing left in Michigan, ancient orchards, forested area for our biodynamic garden, because that's what we really wanted, was a giant biodynamic garden so we could really teach biodynamics. All the students could stay in. It's a huge building with dormitories, with everything, a huge church, St. Anthony's Church, beautiful church. And by the way, it's not possessed, and it's not haunted, which is one of the few you ever come across in the Catholic place. Anything Catholic usually has a real problem. But this place was clean as a whistle. And we ended up moving the Institute out there, and it became where we were at for years. And we got Alan York, the best organic gardener in the world, to come. He started this wonderful garden, and that's where the program was until it finally moved to Spring Valley, New York.
Yeah, I remember I used to go to dinner. I'd take Vernon Glass to dinner, and that way I could ask him a lot of questions. And I really enjoyed that. After I'd take one of his classes, I'd take him out to dinner, and he liked the veal at the Howard Johnson's. But he told me that story about when he was a young man, he was in Assisi, and he was looking at this painting, and this Franciscan walks up to him and says, "Excuse me, are you an anthroposophist?" And he says, "Yes, how did you know?" And he said, "Well, I could tell by the way you were looking at that painting. Come with me." And so he took them down into the library, and there they had the complete Gesamtausgabe in German, and they were trying to figure out Rudolf Steiner's work, and so they were asking him all these questions and all of that. So when the story that Douglas just told about the SCOTUS, when Werner went to go see the place, and they said, "Well, come in here," and they took him into a library, and the room was identical to the room that he saw in Assisi. And he said, yes, that's when he made his decision. When he went in that library, it was like the same room. He said, this is where it's supposed to be. And so that's the genesis of the Waldorf Institute of Teacher Training at Duns Scotus. What a fascinating story.
It was, and he loved that place. I love that place. 2 or 3 times I tried to move in there and live there, but it didn't work out. I went somewhere else. But I kept attending. I was in the Waldorf Institute for 11 years and got my BA and all my master's and all kinds of other stuff. And then I continued to take, the good courses that in some cases I took courses that 11 times, the same course. Like I watched Werner do the Rudolf Steiner seminar, which is his biography, 11 times. I had it memorized by about the 5th time. And one time he's doing it and he literally says, he gets, someone comes in with an emergency message and he says, "I have to go. Douglas, take over. You know what to do." So I just continued the lecture.
I remember, well, you did this more than one time, but Werner had 50 some lectures
54.
And in this one particular lecture, he gets to a point and he'll ask the people there, does somebody have a watch? And Douglas was sitting there with the watch in his hand waiting for him to ask that question.
And the funny thing is, he always did what Steiner said, do something very human at the beginning before you start so that people can identify with you. So he always takes off his watch and he puts it down very carefully and, does something with his glasses and this and that. So here he is asking if anyone has a clock and what time it is when he's looking at one. But he was a graduate of the London School of Dramatic Arts. He had memorized 54 lectures. And he was the most popular lecturer in English in the world. And every weekend he flew out to some place, could be anywhere in the world, to do his thing. And then he'd come back. And so he was always going out and gathering up all this information, meeting people, doing really cool things. Sometimes I'd get to go with him if it was nearby. But he was literally paid to be a lecturer. And, they treat him very nicely. And he'd go one weekend he's in Germany, the next he's in Switzerland, then he's in Hawaii, then he's in Texas, it was crazy. I don't know a weekend he was ever at home in all those years.
Well, yeah, and he spent a lot of time in LA and Hollywood, and he knew so many people through the Michael Chekhov acting school, Michael Chekhov, who I mentioned earlier, and because Werner was a thespian, you know, he was into theater. That's what the milieu in which he thrived in, and he was a mentor for Marilyn Monroe. And I think I've already told that story, but it's such a good one, you know, because I think I told that last week, but I'll tell it again. And that's that he was her mentor, and he was mentoring her through her study of Rudolf Steiner's work. And I remember now, it was in a conversation with Joe and Reverend David that I told the story, so I could tell it again here. Yes, but he got a call from Marilyn Monroe, and she wanted him to come over and see her because she was really feeling down, and he said he couldn't do it because he had a lecture, and that was her last night, you know, when the next he heard that she passed on. But I read, I won't read it here, but I did read the excerpt regarding, they set her up with Dame Edith Sitwell, the famous poet, and they thought that they'd kind of clash, and they thought that'd give them some good journalism. And they sat down, and they got along famously and started discussing the work of Rudolf Steiner, and that the journalist that had put it together had no idea where to go with it, because but Edith Sitwell said that she was brilliant. And so it's interesting that the whole milieu in which Werner moved it, like Yul Brynner and Jack Palance and Brando, people like that he was working at mentoring in the theatric arts in California. But to have him here, it's unbelievably profound, like what Douglas says. And so we've run out of time for this episode, but it leaves us on the edge of our seats to continue on in this story where it's just starting to get into the deeper waters. And so we're going to enjoy this journey with the master teacher, Dr. Douglas Gabriel. My name is John Barnwell, and I want to thank you all for tuning in.